This book has been in the making for almost 5 years. It has not been an easy journey, it's been a difficult journey, but the book is there for all of you to read and arrive at your own conclusion. I don't want to say very much. I'm the publisher and the co-author of the book. There have been a large number of people who've been very, very supportive and helpful, and yet others who told us, you're wasting your time. They dissuaded us. He said, why are you doing this? This was sought to be raised as an election issue in the run-up to the 2019 elections. Nothing happened. So why are you doing it? We believe that the story of the Rafale deal is yet to be told. Yes, we've written 560 pages, but there's more to be told. And in anticipation of those who would claim that our acts have not been in the national interest, or some might even allege that we violated laws of the land, including an act that was enacted more than a century ago when the British ruled our country, the Official Secrets Act. Let me assert with full responsibility that every bit of information that is there in the book has been sourced and is in the public domain. We've tried to connect the dots. We've tried to put together a story which is not complete yet, but a story that we believe needs to be told. I'm particularly grateful to the lead author of this book, Ravi Nair, the tall gentleman right here. This is his first book. Studied economics, went to the Gulf, worked in the corporate sector, did all kinds of things, and almost accidentally became a journalist. With this story, the story of the Rafale deal. We're very happy to have with us lawyer, activist, Prashant Bhushan. He really needs no introduction. He played a very active role in trying to raise this issue before the highest court of the land. And we've examined in great detail, not just what the apex court of this country had to say, but we believe a judgment which left a lot to be desired, a judgment which was deeply flawed in more ways than one, a judgment which exposed the way the government works, including putting out unsigned documents in sealed envelopes with no provenance, and led to the highest court of the land making statements which the bench had to retract because they were downright false. That's part of the book. We are also very critical of a constitutional body called the Controller and Auditor General of India. We've examined information in the public domain. We've used information which is very much in the public domain to try and put together this story. One of the persons who really wrote about this long before others is Ajai Shukla, retired as colonel in the Indian Army. At one stage, almost single-handedly in his column, Broadsword, in his column in the Business Standard, he wrote day in, day out about this deal. Very few people listened to him. But we believe that all the points that he raised have become more relevant than ever before. With us here is Kavita Krishnan. She's a social activist, a political activist, a feminist. And she asked my colleague if she was here because there were only males in this panel, so that this wouldn't be accused of being a manel. I think we explained to her that we contacted 9 different women, and they had their own problems. Some were not available, some were out of station, some didn't want to come, but we are very happy that Kavita is here with us. And we are also very happy to have Mr. Sanjay Hegde, Senior Advocate of the Supreme Court of India. He's been a fighter, a crusader for the truth, and he came at very short notice and agreed to be here with us. Before we have these four gentlemen and the lady here speak, we're first going to connect with three individuals who are outside Delhi. We have the person who wrote the preface to the book, Mr. N. Ram. Mr. N. Ram is the former editor-in-chief of The Hindu. He holds an important position in the group and the company that brings out this publication. He himself played a very important role in writing about and exposing the Bofors deal. And this is in the late 1980s. And in this case as well, in the Rafale case as well, he has written a series of articles. He published a series of articles which threw new light on what was happening and how there were people within the government, people within the Ministry of Defense, who opposed what was going on, what was happening in the highest echelons of the government of India. And in great detail, he wrote about that. Also with us here is joining us from Bengaluru is Aakar Patel. He used to head Amnesty International. He has been, in his own way, a fighter. He's not been allowed to leave this country. He's fighting several cases and continues to fight them, but his spirit has not been dampened one bit. And we also have with us from Chennai, Professor Srinath Raghavan. He's an eminent academic, he's a scholar, he's specialized in analyzing defense affairs, what's happening in the security environment. Senthil, we can start. You can pull off the lights and we can start with Mr. N. Ram.
Thank you, Paranjoy, and my best regards to the other participants in this discussion on a book which is of considerable interest. It's all about, I think the wider setting is corruption, and in my foreword I've dealt with it, as Aakar and others have also addressed it from various perspectives. But let us first recognize that corruption in India is pervasive, omnipresent, and multifarious. And we've had these scandals break out, particularly over the last 2 or 3 decades, relating to key sectors of the economy and also, of course, to defense. And of course, I can't forget the news media, where corruption is also quite pervasive. But corruption in the defense sector is quite different. It's in a league of its own. It's practically inescapable. Defense sector cannot escape corruption. There may be very few exceptions to this. And worldwide, the arms trade is synonymous with bribery and influence peddling under cover of national security and high interests of state. There's a lot of scholarly material on this subject, but a key statistic is that most sources agree on this, most scholarly and expert sources agree on this, that at least 40% of all corruption in legal international trade is linked to arms deals. And what are the factors that explain it? Arms trade corruption survives and indeed flourishes on the back of collusion among states, developed as well as developing, the industry, middlemen, and in many cases on the seller's side, despite the existence of seemingly tough anti-corruption laws, and despite lip service paid to the need to ensure transaction integrity, governments in general accept corruption in practice as an element of defense industrial policy, and there is very strong research backing this up. Researchers have also flagged some key factors that make the arms trade synonymous with corruption. Built-in secrecy surrounding the transaction, the high value of individual deals, offers very attractive opportunities, tempting opportunities for political decision makers to claim substantial kickbacks, even if they're but representing only a small percent of the deal value. The technical complexity of major arms deals, easy to hide corrupt payments, the deal's value, and corrupt motivations in the selection process. Cutthroat competition among arms suppliers, and of course, the willingness of governments of exporting countries to turn a Nelson's eye to corruption. And there's a clear nexus between the arms trade and senior politicians who use the trade as a means of securing political finance. There are many examples of this. So the point I'm making here is, although arms trade corruption is part of the phenomenon of corruption, it's also in a separate category and is often what can be described as grand corruption. I explain what the term means in the foreword, and Aakar Patel also makes the point about grand corruption involving institutions, involving the corruption or distortion of institutions and policies as distinct from transactional corruption and so on. So this is a setting in which we need to view what the book offers us in a more comprehensive, well-documented, and authoritative way than any previous publication. There's a great deal published on the subject here and to some extent in France, but no single source, no coherent account presents the transaction or set of transactions set in proper context the way this book does. I also mentioned in the foreword that when we are doing the Bofors investigation in late 1988, at a sensitive juncture of that investigation, the then President R. Venkatraman, whom I knew very well, who held key ministerial portfolios, including defense, and was known certainly for his integrity, said to me, just like that, don't you know that the standard rate of commission and major defense deals is 6%? This, I think, came from somebody who knew what was happening, and it was an interesting, very short reflection that gave me an insight and strengthened our resolve to get to the bottom of Bofors. Now, this book, The Rafale Deal, Flying Lies by Ravi Nair with Paranjoy, Guha, Thakurta, you can read it ourselves. It tells the story behind India's largest arms deal, valued at 7.8 billion euros. And we know the number of fighter jets that figured in the deal, 36. The way the old deal was just thrown out of the window, the various technical aspects of the deal. But what the book does is a couple of things. It demystifies the technical jargon, complex technical aspects and the jargon. It documents meticulously. And interestingly, to make it more readable and understandable, it works out a narrative structure that to some will feel like this is a non-fiction novel, where, of course, in contrast to the genre, no liberties are taken with the verifiable facts. So this is what the book does. And I think there are 22 chapters in this book. And it raises, I think, all the relevant questions about the price, the hiking up of the price, the procedures that were overlooked or violated or sidestepped, the arbitrary way in which the Prime Minister took the decision-making in his hands, reversing course. Often there were an overlap, contradictory things were being said by one arm of the government or other. For example, the Foreign Secretary, then Foreign Secretary, Mr. Jaishankar, who is now External Affairs Minister, he clearly had no clue about it. Or if he did, he made a very good secret of it just before the visit to Paris. And so the document-based charges leveled against the government, the BJP government, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, included the bypassing of institutions, the violation of mandated or standard procedures laid down for defense acquisitions, resulting in a massive loss to the national exchequer, striking an arbitrary new deal at exorbitant cost to shortchange the Indian Air Force, where the official policy said we need 42 squadrons, fighter jets, and now we are down to 30. And then, equally important, dropping the critical provisions for anti-corruption penalties days before the signing of the intergovernmental agreement, giving up the demand for bank guarantees, and rigging the offset clauses and arrangements. You just got to look at the detail to favor a few crony capitalists. And this, the opposition picked it up. The co-authors say that not very effectively. Comparisons have been drawn with the Bofors scandal in the book and elsewhere. As one who led that investigation in the late 80s, I came to understand that story in terms of 5 modes of action. First, the decision-making on the choice of howitzer, and the motive for the apparent crime lay there. The second mode comprised the specific contracted arrangements for the payoffs, and the actual payoffs covered up as commissions into secret Swiss bank accounts. The third was the cover-up and crisis management that came into play. Hence the title of the book, Flying Lies. You cover up, you're secretive, you don't disclose what needs to be known to the people. And this, of course, in the Bofors case was blown up first by the news arm of Swedish public radio on the secret kickbacks. They'd also named names. The fourth mode of action was the journalistic investigation and expose, and some of the people who are in this discussion contributed handsomely to that. And the fifth was the CBI's long-delayed on and off criminal investigation, assisted by the Swiss Federal Police and the Swiss courts, and of course the prosecution, which ended in complete failure. So in our case also, Rafale, there's an eerie resemblance to how decisions were made in 1985-86. But the key difference, I believe, is money trail. No money trail has been discovered in the Rafale case, although there's some interesting action in France, which is dealt with in the book. That's the key difference. And we don't know how much the picture has changed with the opening of a judicial probe. The book, I think, ends on that note. And it would be pointless to try to second guess the outcome of those investigations and efforts to get to the bottom of the affair in France. But having said that, let me commend the authors for a couple of other things. Chapter 22 is a remarkable, 22 is the story of this interview with Air Marshal retired Raghunath Nambiar. A man the authors acknowledge is extremely, really very knowledgeable on this subject. And it's an interesting engagement, very civil, but involving completely different perspectives. And it's an interesting exercise or example in how the same set of facts with some disputation and with a lot of spin and some glossing can be made to lead to diametrically opposite conclusions. But I commend the retired Air Force officer for engaging with our 2 co-authors, and I commend the authors for the way they conducted this interview and asked all the relevant questions. This is a very unusual inclusion in the book, I think, books of this kind, where you let somebody with a completely different opposing set of views raise this question. 3 sets of questions they ask. To what extent does this decision to reduce the number of the same aircraft from 126 to 36 impinge on India's national security? On Prime Minister Modi's consulting no one while finalizing the terms of the deal and trashing the old Rafale deal arbitrarily. Was this not true, and was it right? The third set of questions, what impact does this have on the interest, on the national interest? Was this not damaging to institutional arrangements and clearly laid down procedures, lawful procedures, and bypassing the various checks that are supposed to precede any such decision? And I think Air Marshal Nambiar gamely engages with the authors and defends the deal all the way, in the process dismissing the established and lawful defense procurement as ineffective, as an obstacle to the Air Force getting what it wants, or the armed forces getting what they want, and virtually useless. I think I commend the authors for this, but there's a great deal more to be learned from this book. It requires concentration. It requires serious attention to the issues at stake. But I can't think of anyone who has addressed these issues better, with specific reference to the Rafale deal, the Rafale scandal. Thank you for this opportunity. Paranjoy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ram, for your very, very important observations and comments. And there's one organization which had to face the brunt of this deal, and that organization belongs to all of us. And that's HAL, or Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. But more of that later. May I now request Professor Srinath Raghavan to give us his comments and his observations on the book.
Well, thank you, Paranjoy, and good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be able to join this event, if only virtually. I suppose I'm a bit of an outlier in terms of this discussion. I'm an academic, I'm a historian who is interested in the evolution of our defense and national security establishments. I did write a few pieces when all of this was unfolding, but I think what this book has given me is a chance to sort of reflect on some of the contemporaneous observations that many of us had, and to think about, what it really sort of tells us as far as our understanding of these very important events were. In a spirit of just taking the discussion forward, I'm not going to focus too much on the aspects that Mr. Ram has focused, which is the whole question of what was the nature of corruption, kickbacks, etc. here. I will be candid in saying that, I did not find those parts of the narrative as compelling as I found the account of policy-making processes and this thing. So I'll focus on those things. I'm happy to sort of take questions. But again, I sense that I'm a bit of an outlier when it comes to this thing, because I really think the central issues that are thrown up by this book are not actually about corruption, but more about deep-seated institutional failings. Again, the title of the book, says the responsibility of the Prime Minister, which at some level he does have. I mean, the buck stops with the Prime Minister. And his role was definitely more active than simply being the buck-stopping authority. But in this case, again, I think it's very important to understand broader institutional sort of weaknesses and failings, which at least as a historian who has studied similar episodes in the past stood out. So in the interest of time and making sure that I'm able to sort of get some of my thoughts provoked by this book across, let me just say that I want to focus on three things. First, this question, which in some ways is a central question: why was the old contract cancelled? And here I would say one of the central contributions of this book is that it has given us a much deeper and more well-grounded insight into what the nature of the previous process, which was superseded by the sort of decision to go for 36 Rafales in 2015. That was the MMRCA deal, which lasted for several years. And I think the authors do a fantastic job of walking us through many of the things. And that is important because it sets the context and the backdrop against which to measure what really came. Because a lot of claims were made saying, oh, this is new, hence the pricing is this, etc. Whereas I think the authors really sort of quite specifically point out that many of these claims are questionable, and that this was a process which kind of is very well documented in this book, right? But when we come to the crucial point of, say, 2015, early 2015, and ask this question of saying, why is the deal scrapped? To my mind, the answers which this book provides, this may not be the answers that the authors necessarily want us to take away, but this is my reading of the book, was that there were primarily two things. One was that the new government certainly felt that the cost of the overall deal of the MMRCA 126 was rather too high. So there was an element of parsimony, a desire to sort of save costs and to somehow, square the circle as far as national security was concerned. The second thing, which again is something that we knew from other sources, but here it brings on, and again, the book documents in great detail, is the fact that the negotiations towards the very close end were dragging on quite a bit, right? And again, I think the authors say that things were pretty close. Dassault and Rafale could have struck a deal with HAL; they were very close, etc. But the fact still remains, especially if we take some of the details provided by the interviewee that Mr. Ram referred to, Admiral Nambiar. He says that pretty much from February 2014 the negotiations were stuck, and that's a line which is also taken by the CAG report, and I think that's a reasonably sort of good read of what was happening, which was that the last mile proved to be rather more difficult for the government to do it, right? So the question then becomes, what was the reason? Why was this very difficult? Again, the answers are known for a while. The first was about computation of manpower costs. The HAL said that the estimates which are provided by Dassault had to be increased by a factor of 2.7. The second thing was who would guarantee the quality of the 126 aircraft. The original RFP required that the vendor should. Dassault was refusing to. They said we'll only take responsibility for 18, and the rest of the 108, which would be produced primarily by HAL, they would not be willing to sort of take the burden for it. So in a very real sense, the negotiations not only seem to have been at something of a standstill, but the government of India had all along not been in a position to really able to force a certain conclusion on Dassault, partly because they felt that they should allow the deal to go through and some solution would emerge. What is also very clear is that by early 2015, the Indian Air Force was clearly on tenterhooks. They were very concerned that this deal was kind of, the whole thing, completion was taking rather too long. Their squadron strength was depleting. They felt their adversaries were marching on in terms of capabilities. And in some ways, the idea that we need to sort of scrap this deal and to go for something, even if it means a smaller set of aircrafts, apparently had originated from the IAF. I mean, that's how I read the evidence which is produced in this book. And I think, therefore, that it's difficult to say that the IAF had nothing to do as far as this decision is concerned. I think they were certainly ideas which originated from there, though they took shape eventually in ways that perhaps the IAF did not really appreciate. The second aspect is something that is not very foregrounded in the book, but Paranjoy referred to it just now. And I think, it's actually a very important thing to understand why the IAF and some of this establishment was eventually willing to sort of scrap the old arrangement, was because of what I think is a deep-seated institutional distrust of the HAL as far as the service is concerned. The HAL is seen as a defense PSU behemoth, which is a monopoly, which did not deliver on important projects like the light combat aircraft. And I think that history is very important when we think about how an institution like the Indian Air Force actually thought of the HAL's position. Now, again, I agree with Paranjoy that that may not be a fair reading of what the HAL's record on these things was. The HAL was also keen, along with Dassault, to sort of close this deal. But I think eventually there was a sense that, depending on the HAL to sort of deliver what has already been a stretched out process, is likely to prove much more cumbersome. The second question, which I think we need to really sort of focus on, and here the book is, I would say, really very, very important, because the account is so careful. Practically every step is traced, again, with all the documents that are available in the public domain, but now triangulated and positioned in ways that I think make the picture rather more clear than anything I've read in the past. The first is, and I think the book sort of brings it out very clearly, that this was a decision which was taken at the highest levels of the government. The Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's office, officials within the Prime Minister's office were clearly, taking the lead once they decided that something else had to be done in order to satisfy the sort of request which was coming from the Indian Air Force. The role of then Defense Minister, late Mr. Manohar Parrikar, is, I think, a little unclear, because my assumption at that point, and reading a lot of many people who were seated on this panel, was that the Defense Ministry and the Defense Minister themselves were perhaps not fully in picture. Though there are other pieces of evidence which they bring out in this book which suggest that Mr. Parrikar may have known something was up. Perhaps he did not know that it would be as low as 36 and that a deal was going to be struck in quite this particular way. So I think that's something that future historians will have to sort of work more closely on. What we do know, and the book reiterates quite clearly, is something that the government of India told the Supreme Court when this case was being heard, that the acceptance of necessity, which is effectively the first step in the procurement process as far as the DPP is concerned, was approved by the Defense Acquisitions Committee, the Apex committee which deals with these things, for 36 aircraft, effectively about 5 weeks after the Prime Minister's visit to France. So that was on 10th of April. The AON, acceptance of necessity, is given on 13th of May, which clearly is a retrofitting of the procedure. Right now, again, Air Marshal Nambiar says, oh, there's nothing to do with this. This was simply a declaration of intent. There was no deal which was struck in Paris and so on, which I entirely agree with Mr. Ram, is, I think, a travesty of what the laid down procedure is. I think the laid down procedure was very clear. Even if we accept that the process was circumvented in the interest of taking some expeditious strategic decision and so on, I think the costs that had to be paid for the circumvention of that procedure merit a little bit of notice. And I just want to point out what I think are 3 very important consequences that came out of this decision. It's all there in the book. I'm just putting it in my own sort of framework and language. The first is that the financial implications of going for a deal of just 36 were never thought through before an announcement was made. Now, we could argue that the specifics would only come up when the negotiations happen. But the basic point, which was that the costs of design and development, which would be proposed by Dassault, which included things called the India-specific enhancement, would remain more or less fixed, whether India went for 36 aircraft or it went for 126 aircraft. At some level, this was the nub of the point. Because these fixed costs could not be negotiated down by very much. Dassault's starting bid was 1.4 billion euros for those development costs. They came down eventually to 1.3 billion. Now, those 1.4 or 3 billion would have been divided across 126 aircraft, or they would have been divided across 36 aircraft. We ended up going for the latter. So we ended up paying a higher price per aircraft. And I think that case is more or less sealed. I mean, no amount of obfuscation can take away from that reality. We can say that we are comparing apples, oranges, but I don't think an elementary sort of, familiarity with mathematics will suggest that we have definitely paid a higher cost per unit by going for this deal. And why did this happen? Because there was nobody in the system of decision making who would have actually pointed out that this is the likely position which would be taken by Dassault. Because all your financial advisors in the Ministry of Defense, etc., do not seem to have been part of the loop before the announcement for 36 was made. So that's the first consequence, is that financial sort of implications for us. Now, this had a second and I think a linked implication, which had to do more with our negotiating position of the government of India when it came to negotiating even this 36 thing. Right, see, if you look at it from Dassault's point of view, the government of India has not really been able to hold your feet to the fire as far as the MMRCA deal was concerned. They were supposed to guarantee all 126. They refused to do that. And we allowed the negotiations to sort of string out. And then we scrap that and still say that we want 36. That shows a degree of dependence, a degree of weakness as far as a negotiating position is concerned. It's not at all surprising, therefore, that Dassault said, listen, this is about what we can offer. Because they were believing that they had a stronger hand. The Air Force needed at least these 36, having scrapped MMRCA before anything else happened. So we were actually speaking in a very weak negotiating position, which I think explains why very sensible points of dissent which were raised by members of the contract negotiating committee. And here I'm referring to the documents that Mr. Ram put out in the Hindu, which laid out why this cost was prohibitive. We should never have gone in for these, asked for various other kinds of guarantees, etc., were not accepted. Why? Because we could not allow this deal to slip through. We needed 36 at a minimum for the Indian Air Force. Otherwise, you'd be in a very real soup. And that again was a consequence of not really thinking through and weakening our negotiating position right up front. The third is the largest strategic consequence of doing all of this stuff, right? Because it's not very clear whether the Air Force itself recommended scrapping the MMRCA deal. Air Marshal Raghunath says as much in his interview, but I don't think he was part of that particular process at that point of time, though he's extremely familiar with what he's saying. In any case, the Air Force should have thought harder about what would be done as far as the remainder requirement is concerned, because the Air Force's requirement is actually pretty heavy. So what are you going to do when you just sit with 36? What about the rest of the 90 or more? So eventually what happens is that we effectively restart the process. We give out a request for information for 110 aircraft, which is then kind of set aside. And then we come up with another kind of, request for proposals, etc., which is currently underway. And all of this is extremely well documented in the book to show that in effect, our strategic and defense preparation is perhaps been set behind by several years because of this unthought through sequence of decisions which was taken. The Air Force's immediate requirement might have been met, but the fact is that The situation as far as overall squadron strength, etc. is concerned is steadily deteriorating. That has all kinds of implications. For instance, the Indian Air Force is very reluctant to accept integrated theatre commands because they believe they have far few resources which will then be splintered up to non-Air Force commanders, etc. That is one of the main reasons why the Air Force opposes integration of theatre commands and so on. So this has again had important strategic knock-on consequences for the way that all of this has happened. So in conclusion, what I'd say is that you're absolutely right. The authors are right in saying that this saga was played out as effectively political decisions taken at the highest office, which I think even the Prime Minister and his party accepted, except that they put a positive sort of take on it by saying that he demonstrated leadership and so on. But I think this entire episode, which is covered in this book, which includes the MMRCA period right through to where we are, brings out the various kinds of weaknesses in our system. I mean, take the Ministry of Defense. The fact that under the previous MMRCA deal, after an L1 contract had been awarded to Dassault, there were doubts about whether the life cycle cost computation had been done correctly or not. We were not confident of our own procedures. When a couple of parliamentarians wrote to then Defense Minister A.K. Antony, he actually had an inquiry done. But that inquiry, even if when it said that no, Dassault was L1, he said no. Just to be sure, when everything is complete, we'll go over this all over again, right? It suggests a system which is not really confident of its own strengths and judgments. Second, the services themselves. In this case, the Indian Air Force. And I don't mean to single out the Air Force because I'm a former Army man, but simply because I think the Air Force was the lead agency in this case. Clearly, this is an agency which could not think about its own strategic requirements with any degree of foresight and vision, contrary to all the claims which have been made. The fact that all the consequences that I laid out for you have flowed from that decision to push the government for saying, we need to get out of this arrangement. Even 36 is fine. We can somehow sort of put things together. I think all of that proved to be serious misconsequences. And the last is our entire national security apparatus, where we seem to be mistaking decisiveness for thoughtfulness, where we believe that somehow the important thing is to take a decision and to cut the Gordian knot without understanding that when you cut such knots, there are other threads which also unravel. And that in some ways, the important thing about strategic decision making is the ability to see what the second, third order consequences will be. And I think instead of boiling everything down to a matter of political will, etc., this is there. And the reason I'm emphasizing this point is to go back to Mr. Ram's last point, right? Admiral Nambiar says that the DPP is a very cumbersome thing. I've heard that being said by people across the system, in the Ministry of Defense, across the things, right? Now, it may well be true that the DPP is very cumbersome. It does not allow for adequate private sector partnership. It is not unleashing all of India's internal talents, etc. But doing that cannot be done as an act of political fiat. If we are replacing one set of systems, we need better set of systems and processes to take through. We cannot, sign off the strategic sort of requirements of this country to the wisdom of a handful, however wise and however powerful they be. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Srinath, Raghavan. May I request Aakar Patel to give us his comments and his views? Yes, and we are sort of running a little behind schedule. Aakar.
I will be brief. Thank you very much for asking me to speak. Thank you to all who have gathered here today, including my fellow panelists. Thank you above all to the two authors, Mr. Nair and Mr. Guha Thakurta, for having done this work. I'll make a few very brief points. The first is that I think it is obligatory on the government to respond to this book. When it's out, given its tone and given the material it contains, it would be important that the Ministry of Defense and perhaps the PMO as well respond to the points that have been made and to the allegations that raise themselves once the book is read. I had the opportunity and the good fortune to read the book a few months ago. And I felt that it was the kind of material that in any democracy ought to raise questions of the sort that are usually not raised in this country. This is a good opportunity for this government to bring about the levels of transparency that an issue as important as national security and the acquisition of material such as this requires. The second point I'll make is that there seems to me to be much less media interest in this story than there was in, say, Bofors. Ram spoke about some of the reasons why this was, including the lack of a trail. But generally speaking, I think given the fact that the Hindu lent its voice to the debate, it was incumbent, in my opinion, on the media to take this story forward in a way that it had done 30 years ago and hasn't done at this point. I think that the two big stories of the late 80s were Bofors and Ram Janmabhoomi, and I don't think that this has been the case for the Rafale deal. Though I would say that in some measure, many of the same things have come to light here, including the fact that there is a media agency of repute in the country of origin of the equipment that has reported quite well on this. There has been not too much light thrown by the state here, and the media has been okay with this. The third point is that I think that we are talking about hardware that is to be used over generations. We are still flying fighter jets that we acquired more than 50 years ago. And I think that the idea that we are okay with getting 36 instead of 120 odd, and there be no questions raised about why this is to me quite strange. That this is not the sort of decision that you would take on the fly, though it was taken on the fly. And there was no explanation for why this was the case. To some of us, it might seem to be the case that there is a pattern of seat of the pants decision making on the side of the economy, on the side of national security even, that continues here. But that also speaks to a lack of opacity. I think that we ought to have had a wider debate on why it is that we are okay at the moment with 36 when the requirement was for 4 times as many aircraft. The fourth point I'll make is that it seems to me again that the judiciary has given a pass to the state here and let it off with things, including mistakes it has made in its judgment for factual errors that the book points out, that other journalists have also pointed out too. Also, the idea that this subject is so sensitive that it ought not to be put in the public domain and material be restricted to sealed covers. I think that this is not the way that democracies function. And I'll go back to my first point about the idea that the government the state used this, the ministries use this book as a point of debate, that can we take a look at our democracy, our state, and see whether we can make it less opaque through answering the questions that come up with this book. My final point is on the idea that that we ought to trust in individuals, that individuals who take decisions outside of the format that the system, by which I mean the sort of democratic space that we have within the parliamentary democratic system, be overturned, and you have an executive which either overrules or changes what it is that has come from below, is unusual. And I think that while this book, it is a really rich book, and I would recommend it very highly to those who haven't read it already. This sort of book shows us what kind of systemic failure comes up when individuals are put above processes and systems. And I think that it is incumbent on us, as whether we are part of the media, whether we are part of the legal system, as two of the panelists are, or whether we are part of the political system, as one of the panelists is, look at this closely and be able to engage with it in a more meaningful way than the rest of the polity has. I congratulate the authors for having picked people on the stage who have had an active part with dealing with some of the questions that I have spoken about. I hope this book is read. I hope this book is translated into Hindi. And I hope, above all, that the state chooses to respond to the questions that it raises. Thank you very much.
I was just thinking today that as I was reading this book, which I got some days ago, that Ravi and I are probably the same age. And I remember very well, I think it was when in 1987, 88, I was in a small town, Bhilai. I was in school, and the Hindu newspaper came to Bhilai one day late because it was a Madras edition, and by the time it reached Bhilai, it was one day late. Obviously, nothing online and all of that. So I still remember waiting for, my mother, waiting eagerly for every day for what was in the Hindu on the Bofors deal, looking for documents published on the front page, trying to read, trying to make sense. And I know that probably that was the first experience for me of being part of a political discourse in public, which was happening in the public sphere, which people were talking about, who were around us. And that was a time, if we went out to walk the dog, we'll come back, to listen to the news on DD. Now, I think I compare that atmosphere where a schoolgirl could feel that she knew what was happening and was invested and interested in every fact that appeared on a newspaper front page. And I think that, therefore, this was a small part of that entire, the fact that Bofors was part of the entire public sphere. And I'm not going into, the size of scandal and all of that. The point is about transparency. The point is about citizens' right to know. And now you have this plethora of channels, lots of noise, but a noise that silences facts, completely silent. So the fact is that this feat of investigative journalism, and I liked it precisely because I felt that I could sense every nut and bolt, every element of the story being tested as you read the book, and you are told, that what the authors think of this piece of evidence, how strong is it, how weak is it, and you also have the information to make up your mind. But the point is that this is a book. This is a wonderful piece of investigative journalism, but in order for this to become something that can become a part of a larger political discussion, it needs to be amplified. And that has not happened these last 5 years. It has not happened. In 5 years, this book took in the writing, I think it says. It certainly hasn't happened in the public sphere. So I just think that, I think people in politics, people in activism, we know that the nature of the media now is this. The nature of the public sphere is something which the government controls, which means that it's just like those debates on TV. Critics of the government have a role assigned, and the way in which your voices are going to be reaching or not reaching the public, all that there's an attempt to control. How to get past it is probably possible to do only through finding a way to amplify these facts and these discussions through some, through political parties as well, making this part of their conversation with people, not just as a propaganda point, but as information. Because I feel that information and investigation, these are the foundation of any kind of politics and political sphere. And it is that is under attack right now. One last thing, observation, which I'll say, which I'm sure we all share, is that, I love that bit about basically Ravi being an accidental journalist. Because I do remember those first stories about Rafale, and I remember meeting him and realizing that this person is not a journalist before this. So essentially someone from a different sphere who thinks that as a citizen they need to hunt down these facts, which are there in the public domain, but the story needs to be told, the connections need to be made. And he felt the need to do it, and he did it. And he's done it, carried it through with Paranjoy all the way till here. So, I find that to be an act of hope. And so, it's encouraging and inspiring, I think, and of course, extremely courageous to be doing this. And I hope it inspires a lot more people to do this, whether they are formally journalists, paid up journalists or not.
Mr. Sanjay Hegde, Senior Advocate.
Thank you, Paranjoy. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. And your presence here is proof that the issue is not dead, that we still want to know. And despite all the noise that we hear on television, on channels which offer to let you know, we still want to think quietly, look at the evidence, look at the author's assessment of it, and say, yes, now we are a bit more educated. I now find that Kavita and I are approximately the same age, and Mr. Ram, we have to thank you, because it was you who educated us in those days about how decisions were made. And I did not think at that point of time that I would be in a forum where those decisions were checked. Those decisions often get checked at the Supreme Court level, and at the Supreme Court level, what we are told is that we are not interested in checking the merits of the decision. We are only interested in auditing the process. Was that decision-making process correctly undertaken? Now, while I was reading this book, it reminded me of the old proverb that we have in law, that the truth will out even on an affidavit. Despite all the affidavits that went and the sealed covers that went without affidavits, the truth is out here. The source material is here. And for somebody who looks at the deal and at the history of defense deals in India, going way back to 1948, the first year after independence, when Mr. Krishnan ignored all procedures, paid 80 lakhs for jeeps that never arrived, or when they arrived, were not usable. And if you look at the processes then, the decision-making processes then, and the decision-making processes today, all that really has changed is the number of zeros, the total amount that gets siphoned off into shady bank accounts. What can the judiciary do? And very often, I do think that what happened in the 70s with a call for a committed judiciary had its impact on the kind of judges that came thereafter. After the 1970s, you rarely had any decision that a government had invested its political capital in being actually questioned by the courts or being struck down by the courts. As a constitutional historian, I cannot recollect after the Privy Purses case any particular decision where the government had put in its political capital being struck down by the courts of its time. Of course, subsequent judges came around and said, no, our predecessors got it wrong. And those decisions are buried 5 fathoms deep or 30 fathoms deep, as they said about ADM Jabalpur. So if and when somebody decides that we are going to look at the deal again, or the processes which were sanctified by the Supreme Court in its judgment, this will be invaluable source material. I must congratulate Ravi and Paranjoy on bringing this out. I would keep my remarks to this brief intervention. I'll be willing to take more questions later on. And more particularly, because on the legal front, Prashant has done much more on this. And though I am a designated senior, he is senior to me in not only in age, but in the richness of his experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Prashant, over to you.
First, I want to congratulate both Ravi and Paranjoy for writing this book, making the effort to write this book. I think it's an invaluable piece of information which will be historically very, very important in the time to come. What strikes you, actually I had once written a book on the Bofors deal in 1990 and had the occasion to look at that very carefully. If you compare the Bofors deal with the Rafale deal, there are many things which are very, very striking. See, in the Bofors deal, as Mr. Ram said, there was a money trail, and that's what excited a lot of people. But other than that, there wasn't that much by way of national security being compromised in that deal. Of course, the money trail was about 64 crores. Here we have a deal which, in my view, compromises national security to a very, very large extent. Because what it did was to scrap a deal which was in the making for a long time, almost concluded, where the Air Force had said that we require 126 aircrafts. They still say that because now they have issued another RFR for another more than 100 aircraft. So there was a clause of Make in India, transfer of technology in that earlier deal. And of course, the price was much less. Even the then Defense Minister, Mr. Parikar, the maximum that he could say as a price for those 126 aircraft was 1,30,000 crores. He said that, well, that was scrapped because it would have cost 90,000 crores, which was too much for us. Then he says, okay, it would have cost 110,000. Then he said 130,000, but that was the maximum, which comes to about 1,000 crore per aircraft. Finally, the deal which was struck for 36 aircraft was more than 1,600 crores per aircraft. But leaving aside the price, what you have done is, and this happened completely unilaterally. If you read the book, you'll realize that there is a very detailed laid down procedure for the procurement of any defense equipment, especially something as critical as aircraft. That first the Air Force has to say how many aircraft they need, what kind of aircrafts they need, what kind of capabilities they should have, etc. Thereafter, the matter goes to another committee called the Categorization Committee, which then discusses and decides as to whether these can be made in India, whether they have to be procured from abroad, whether there can be some parts made in India, some parts procured from abroad. Then it goes to a body called the Defense Acquisition Council, which has everybody, Defense Minister, Finance Minister, Air Force Chief, etc., etc. And they take a final call as to what kind of aircrafts, how many aircrafts, etc. And then a request for, what's it called? RFR. RFP, request for proposal is made, and then a tender is issued. All that had been done. 4 companies were invited to make bids. 2 bids were shortlisted. Thereafter, one was this Dassault was found R1. Negotiations with, and several people are on record, even as late as March 2015, on the eve of this new deal, to say that the old deal, that the process for acquiring 126 aircraft, out of which 18 would be bought in a ready-to-fly condition and the remaining 108 would be made in the HAL factory with transfer of technology, was almost complete. They all said 95% complete, almost done. And at that stage, without even the defense minister knowing that this deal, which was almost done in the offing for the last 10 years, is about to be scrapped by the Prime Minister unilaterally. The Prime Minister just calls him 1 week before his trip to France and tells him, I'm going to scrap this deal and get into another deal and you'll have to defend it. And thereafter he goes to France and suddenly announces a completely new deal without any process of the Air Force first saying, all right, we
we are now happy with 36. You should scrap that 126, that we want all 36 ready to fly, we don't want any transfer of technology, etc. And even if the price was negotiated subsequently, you negotiated it from such a weak position because, you see, and this is one other thing that we learned from the manner in which this 36 aircraft deal was struck by Modi alone, is the same way in which he took the decision for demonetization. Nobody was consulted. Not even the Reserve Bank was told in the evening at 5 o'clock, and at 6 o'clock they gave their go-ahead, and at 8 o'clock in the evening Modi announced this decision. Finance Minister didn't know, the Council of Economic Advisors didn't know, nobody was consulted. And unilaterally that decision was announced, which was an unmitigated disaster. None of the objectives of demonetization were achieved, and enormous misery was inflicted on the people. And I say that this decision of Mr. Modi, and thereafter, of course, everybody followed suit, meaning they all went through the motion of ratifying it, the Defense Acquisition Council ratified it, and so on and so forth. But that was after the Prime Minister had publicly announced this decision to scrap the earlier deal and go in for a new deal. So what has that done? Why do I say that decision seriously compromised national security? At the one hand, it led to reducing the aircrafts which were going to come from 126 to 36. Everybody was ad idem in the Air Force. Even today they say that we need 100 more aircraft. No dispute among anybody about that. And yet the Prime Minister himself scrapped the earlier deal and went in for only 36. And no transfer of technology, no make in India. And on top of that, he chooses an offset partner. If you read the book, it's absolutely crystal clear that Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister, chose the offset partner as Anil Ambani of this Reliance Industries, a failed businessman with debts of over 1 lakh crore, who has publicly declared that I am bankrupt, I don't have any money to pay back, I am totally bankrupt. That gentleman is chosen as the offset partner to take care of 50% of the price of this deal by way of Make in India, who has never ever had anything to do with even making a screw for any defense equipment or of any kind. That gentleman is suddenly picked out of the blue and made the offset partner. Then, as I said, the price, the benchmark price was suddenly changed. The people who objected to the change of the benchmark price in the relevant committees were hastily removed. The people in the price negotiating committee who objected to it were also removed. All kinds of toadies were brought in. The CAG was first time in the history of the CAG. It did an audit where pricing details are removed from the audit of this Rafale deal. And the government knew in advance, before the CAG report was prepared, the government told the Supreme Court in a note in a sealed cover, without any affidavit, that CAG has done the audit has been placed before the PSC, and they have removed the pricing details. Now, how does the government know, before the CAG report is prepared, that pricing details will be knocked out of this CAG report? Never happened in history before. First time it was being done, but the government knew in advance, which also throws very poor light on the CAG, that it is willing to do whatever the government wants it to do. And then the Supreme Court, the CBI, you see, we gave a complaint to the CBI pointing out that, look, there is corruption involved in this deal. Corruption is not just money trail in that sense. The Prevention of Corruption Act defines corruption as an act by which you abuse your authority in order to give a windfall to anybody. It could be a windfall to you, it could be a windfall to anybody. In this case, it was absolutely clear that a huge windfall was going to come to Anil Ambani's company by way of 50% offset, 30,000 crores of offset, and Anil Ambani's company announced in a press conference that we are getting 30,000 crores by way of offset contracts in this deal. So, that's clear corruption. We made a very serious, detailed complaint, that is Mr. Arun Shori, Mr. Yashwant Sinha and I, to the CBI director. We went and met the CBI director, and the day he was to take a decision on this, the file was lying on his table. The night before that, there was a midnight coup by which the government sent several hundred police officers to take over his office, seal his office, seize all the papers from his office, and he was removed at midnight. That CBI director never happened in history before. Ultimately, of course, the Supreme Court said that it was illegal, but by the time they said that, he would have retired, so he was not really reinstated back. So, this is what was done to the CBI. And Supreme Court, of course, the less said the better, because we had gone to the Supreme Court seeking an investigation into this deal, and we pointed out so many things, that all the procedures have been gutted, the price has been increased, and we had gone with absolute documentary evidence, and more evidence came out during the hearing by way of Hindus' revelations, etc. And the Supreme Court took it as if we were questioning the contract itself. And they said, they used this non-existent CAG report, which the government, which CAG report hadn't come, which the government had just claimed in an unsigned note given to the Supreme Court in a sealed cover, which just completely guts the principles, the basic principles of natural justice, that you rely upon an unsigned note given to you in a sealed cover, you don't even share it with the other people. That note makes all kinds of false claims that a CAG report has come, it has been handed over to the PSC, it has been made public, all false. And on that basis, you give a judgment saying that there is nothing wrong with this contract because the CAG says there is nothing wrong with this contract. It's astounding what all happened. And of course, the great shame is that such a huge scandal, it's 100 times bigger scandal, defense scandal, than the Bofors scandal. Everything was shredded, every procedure, every institution, cover-up of monumental proportions, much bigger than even the Bofors cover-up. Of course, in Bofors, the other thing was, apart from the money trail, was the cover-up. Here, everything, national security sacrificed, Air Force requirement sacrificed, and yet the big media or the mainstream media doesn't even follow up the story. So I'm very happy that Paranjoy and Ravi have done this great public service by putting together all these facts in one place. And I'm sure, of course, there is an ongoing investigation in France, and I'm sure that more information will come out in the time to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prashant Bhushan. We'll ask Ajai Shukla to speak.
You sure? Sure, Ajay. Of course, I'm very sure. Thank you all for coming to listen to this talk, and even more, thank you all for staying on until this stage. I'm the last speaker, and I would say that given the quality of the speakers that have come before me, everything that had to be said has already been said. I will just focus on three issues, 3 points that really ask questions more than our answers to anything. The first important point to remember is that the Prime Minister decided to buy 36 fully built Rafales and told the defense minister to justify the decision further. He was not here when the decision was announced. He was in France at that stage, the Prime Minister, and it was left to the to Defense Minister Manohar Parrikar to justify it to the media, to the press, everybody who was asking about it. The second point that I will remind you about is that the Indian Air Force really wanted the Mirage 2000 aircraft. It has had a long-standing love affair with the Mirage 2000. When the Balakot bombings had to be done, they used the Mirage 2000, even though it was several decades old at that time. So the Rafale is actually a second choice, and so much was done to make sure that we get the second choice. And the third point that I will touch upon is how much did each of these aircraft actually cost? There are sort of different views on this. I'll just try and bring some logic to that. Now, on the evening of April the 3rd, 2015, Defense Minister Parrikar got out of his office and sat down in his car outside South Block. It was Friday evening. He was going to Goa. A sensible politician that he was, he realized that his sort of job hung by a thread, and that people who did not have backups in their jobs could suddenly find themselves without anything to do. So he would go most weekends to Goa and service his constituency over there, meet people, and as it turns out, it was a wise step because he was bumped off and sent off to Goa, where he became the chief minister. With him, when he was sitting down in this car, was one person who told me the story. I can now tell you the story because Mr. Parrikar is no more, sadly, and there is no sort of body to sort of catch on to the business of source protection. A phone call came on Mr. Parrikar's mobile, and it said somebody spoke into the thing. This is all recounted to me by this person who was there with him, that the Prime Minister is calling you. Could you come to his office right now? So there was a question of catching a flight, but Mr. Parrikar quickly went to the Prime Minister's office. He was told at that stage, it was April the 3rd, April the 11th, the Prime Minister was going to be in Paris, and he said, I'm going to announce this, the purchase of 36 Rafale aircraft. And you will be here. I will be 11 days on tour in France, Germany, and Canada, which was where he was going. And I'll leave it to you to handle the press. So that was basically the first time that the defense minister of the country knew what his biggest contract, which way it was headed. Taken aback, Mr. Parrikar still caught his flight to Goa. Over the next 2 weeks, I think it was, he batted on behalf of the Prime Minister. He did an interview with Doordarshan. He did an interview with Karan Thapar. He did an interview with several other agencies, defending a decision that he neither agreed with nor sort of understood quite clearly. But he made one thing very clear in all the interviews that he did. He said, this is all the genius of the Prime Minister. And gave full credit to Mr. Modi, knowing that this is going to come back anew. A week later, or a week earlier, two journalists from the Godi media, to quote my friend Ravish Kumar, had written already, probably as a sort of means of testing the air, that the Rafale deal in Paris will be reduced to 20 to 40 days. Anyway, since that conversation with Modi, Parrikar never once acknowledged any role in the purchase of 36 Rafales. Instead, he took pains to credit Mr. Modi. On 11th April 2015, just to quote one of the things he said, he said it's a great decision taken by Prime Minister Narendra Modi on better terms and conditions than we had earlier. The second point, the IAF wanting the purchase of the Mirage 2000. From 1982, which was when the Mirage 2000 first came to India, and Dassault signed the main Mirage agreement, it was called the MMA. This was what the Air Force wanted. The origins of the Rafale purchase go back to August 2000, when the IAF proposed ordering 6 squadrons of Mirage 2000s. The government of India did not accept that proposal. In March 2001, IAF submitted the same proposal again. But what had just happened? George Fernandez had just been burnt in the Tehelka scam, and he said, I am going as per a full international global tender with all the bells and whistles, no arbitrary judgments over here. In 2002, they again had discussions. In 2003, IAF tells the Defense Procurement Board that the Mirage 2000 is the best option. He said it's similar to the Eurofighter and the Rafale, but less costly. And after a year, that is now in 2004, they draw up ASQRs. That's the capability list of the aircraft that you're buying. And the Mirage deal is, so the Rafale deal is on its way. So how much did each of those 36 fully built Rafales actually cost? Many different figures have emerged. Speaking to Doordarshan on April 13th, Parikar, when he was doing his initial justification of the deal, said when you talk of 126 Rafales, it becomes a purchase of 90,000 crores. This was the first time anybody had actually given a clear figure, and it was the defense minister giving the clear figure. So we can assume that was the bid that had been opened. It becomes a purchase of 90,000 crores. That is 715 crore per fighter after adding all the costs. The government figures after signing the contract, they bought 36 Rafales for euro 7.8 billion. That's 58,000 crores in that value, which is now over 1,600 crores per aircraft, which is more than double the earlier price of 715. The government says the current contract includes a large number of things that were not there in the earlier contract, including a superior weapons package with Meteor missiles, performance-based logistics, which means that there will be 75% of the aircraft serviceable at all times, and so on. The purchase, with all of that, deducting euro 2.8 billion for the weapons and PBL, a euro 5 billion price for 36 Rafales put the ticket price of each at over 1,000 crores. For that, the IAF can buy 2.5 Sukhoi 30 MKIs, which is a heavier fighter, which can sort of outperform the Rafale in many respects. Now, there is one extremely important point over here in this financials thing, and I am going to put it before you, even though I should be shutting up now. I'll put it before you because this is going to come up again. And that is that this issue of India-specific enhancements, this means that the Rafale aircraft that France made, that Dassault made for the French Air Force is not good enough for the Indian Air Force, and therefore there are 36 odd capability enhancements that need to be done for the Indian Air Force to accept it. And for building those capabilities into the Rafale, we paid them 2.8 billion euro extra. Now, that means that any future Rafales that we buy should come with all these enhancements because we have paid 2.8 billion euros for that. This is not at all clear whether it will come with those enhancements. And knowing the way the European arms dealers do business, they are quite likely to charge once again for the enhancements that are put in the aircraft. So do remember when you're reading about the purchase of Rafales for maybe the aircraft carrier that is coming into business, we have already paid a large amount of money, and that money should be deducted from the cost of the aircraft in the future. I'll leave it over there. I'm sure there are more questions than answers, and I'll look forward to batting some of those.
Come up and ask your question. Introduce yourself. Please keep your intervention as short as possible, and your question, please come.
Good evening. My name is Raghavan. A question that comes to me, that the idea of doing this offset for the Make in India. So how much did we benefit out of this offset in Make in India? What kind of manufacturing that did we grow out of this offset?
You want to come up and ask a question, please? Please come. Please come. We are recording it and we'll put it up on YouTube.
My name is Anurag. I just wanted to know how come Reliance got engaged in it, and the offset clause. Who exactly pays Reliance, and what is Reliance going to do in the whole thing? That's what I.
Please come. We'll take this as the last intervention, and then I'll ask the panelists to react.
Hello, good evening. My name is Raghavan. I have one very specific question. It's more into technicality.
If the aircraft deal was cancelled for 126 aircraft, there was an urgency made that we require urgent delivery of aircraft, so 36 have to be bought off the shelf, and we are going to buy Rafale. My first pointed question is, okay, fine, Rafale is already tried and tested according to the papers, and you're going to buy it, so you're going to buy it. Why was the deal price changed from 560 crores per aircraft to 1600 crores per aircraft? If we had to do that, already HAL is manufacturing our Sukhoi 30 MKI at 380 crores per aircraft. If there was so much urgency, you didn't have to go all around the world. You could have picked up your Sukhois from here only. That is one question. Second is, now we are going into the same process. What we've done with Rafale, we are going to legalize the balance 170 aircraft requisition, which is now in the pipeline by the Air Force. That means they only change the numbers, the figures, the bottom line will be the same, the corruption will be continuous. Are you getting the point? So, why was Sukhoi left out when that is the more advanced aircraft than the Rafale that we are buying out? Thank you.
Yes, please. Please come up. If you have any more questions, you too, please. Please keep your questions short. Please come. Please come. Introduce yourself too.
Good evening to you all. I am S.L. Mehra. Shall I request the two eminent lawyers, Messrs. Prashant, Bhushan is already gone, Mr. Sanjay Hegde, to find ways de novo how to tie a knot around the neck of the government when the facts are known to us. All right. Thank you.
Please come. And this is the last question I'm taking.
I am Vineet Tiwari from Joshi Adhikari Institute of Social Studies. My question is to all the audience, not just to the panelists. What are we going to, these people have done their work. Now what Kavita suggested to amplify it, we all should have some idea and we all should think about it. What are we going to do to amplify this?
First question was on the utility of offsets and what purpose they serve. Theoretically, offsets serve a very useful purpose of counter trade, which is that when you buy something from a particular country, pay them in foreign exchange or in the exchange rate that's decided. In return for that, they should pump something back into your economy. And the deal as formulated by the Indian Ministry of Defense was
that for all purchases over 200 crore rupees, 50% of the value of the purchase would be pumped back into the Indian economy. Now, this is theoretically a very wonderful idea. Practically, what they do is simply add on the cost of the sort of offset onto the cost of the deal. That is to say that if they were doing a 300 crore rupee deal, which had 30 crore rupees of offsets attached to it, they would just add that onto the deal and you end up paying upfront for the offsets. So most countries have stopped doing offsets. They've figured out that this is a sort of take with one hand and give with the other. But India sort of moves a little slower than most. So we still have, theoretically, we have offsets. Second question was why Reliance? Why does Reliance Reliance is, as we all know, it's in sort of a sort of debt situation, allegedly, purportedly, and there was one more sort of rider that should have been made. They are in the business of suing people for making any comments on them. I got a legal notice myself for 1,000 crores, so just pass the hat around. You also got 1,000 crores, okay. And final question was on the urgency of what? The why we need to get. Why did we not? Why did we not? When we needed a particular weapon system, why do we not get it? There are endless stories about why we need so many weapon systems. We at the current moment need destroyers, we need aircraft carriers, we need submarines, we need helicopters, but we're not getting them because at the end of it, there's a guns versus butter debate. There's a question of whether you have the money to spend on arms and weaponry or not. Indian sort of political leaders across the political spectrum have by and large agreed that we don't have the money to spend on weaponry and we need to curb our spending on this matter. So it's a debate that will go on. Eventually, some weapon systems will come through the pipeline, some will not, some will be blocked because of other pressing engagements, and that's how it is in most countries. So, I mean, we're a poor country by any standards.
Yeah. So, no, just to say that, I think, all the questions will be answered by people who are more competent than I am. But I think Ajai will agree with me if I say that this book is very valuable because it's also perhaps the most in-depth case study that we have of any of the kind of defense procurement kind of questions that we've seen. I think the depth of the material, the quality of the analysis, everything is really remarkable. And I think there is a lot to learn from this episode, not just for people within the system, but those outside it as well. And I think, the authors have to be absolutely commended and congratulated for giving us something that I think we'll continue to chew on for a long time to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Srinath.
I just want to say, in continuation of what I said, because there wasn't a question specifically directed at me, I just think that as part of a political campaign, the effort should be to increase the expectations of citizens rather than to scale them down. We should scale them up. So, looking towards, say, a democracy like America with all its 100 problems. I mean, obviously, people there are complaining about the erosion of institutions there. But it is still possible there for a former president to be given a subpoena and asked to appear before a hearing where, and publicly answer for certain actions or non-actions. That is what, in the light of these kinds of findings, one should promise as that should be one of the key opposition sort of promises, that kind of transparency, a system where you will be able to there will be a channel dedicated to these things like C-SPAN, and we can actually see who's asking what questions and what answers are being given.
I was asked a question on what next as far as the legal process is concerned. This one is dead. The challenge to the 36 aircraft is dead. It's been buried. The review petition is over, and I don't think a curative was filed. But if, and I have no doubt that someday or the other there will be a money trail which will come out. If there is any evidence of a money trail and criminality, that would stand on its own facts, and I hope it does come out. This is just the beginning.
May I request Aakar Patel to give his closing remarks?
Thank you very much once again. I'll say that we ought to consider this a very serious subject, that many will know that by default our national security position has shifted from being counterinsurgency, Pakistan focused on the West, to suddenly being dragged into the East against China, where more hardware is required by default. And I think that given the situation we find ourselves in, it is important that we let go of casually taken arbitrary decisions in this space and bring more thought and introspection into what it is that we're doing. The best way to begin this is to have a look at what we've done in the recent past. And I hope that this book serves as the starting point for this introspection. I have no hope on this count, but I'm saying that it should be said nonetheless, that for a polity that has seen its national security hauled violently from west to east over the last 24 months, it is incumbent on it to be able to look at itself in a more transparent manner than it has been. Thank you very much.
Yes, I have nothing much more to add. I think a lot of ground has been covered. But I want to reiterate the importance of seeing it in the context of corruption, also broadly construed as a distortion or subversion of institutions and institutional checks, and while and having to honor procedures. On a specific subject, a specific issue, in that chapter 22, where the two authors engage with retired Air Marshal Raghunath Nambiar, I think they have him in some embarrassment at one point. I would invite you to look at that. When they ask this question about when this whole thing got stuck, he says, the whole process of 126 HAL and so on, they remind him that there was an offer from of the Eurofighter on the face of it with a 20% discount and transfer of technology, offer to establish production facilities in India and so on. So when they ask them, why didn't you consider it? He comes up, I think, with some very strange remarks, which says this is a completely new deal. Then they say, but that is a new deal. What actually was transacted. And then he says, no, this would involve another extended set of negotiations. So it's not persuasive, I think, this part. It fits with what the Air Force wanted. It fits with what the government wanted. But I think that there is something hidden there that is worth thinking about. My final thought is, as for amplification, now journalists investigating something that is complex in a protracted investigation often invest too much emotions in having justice rendered in this case. Not that it is a bad thing, but I think very often it's a pipe dream because you're dealing with a completely different area or a territory about which you don't know enough. Sanjay Hegde, Mr. Hegde, pointed to some of that, Prashant did, and so on, the failings of the judicial system. So in my experience, when journalists invest too much emotion and hope on getting the fruits of their investigation translated into justice in the courts of law, I think there is a problem there. At the same time, we are citizens who want to amplify, want this to reach a proper, just conclusion. So there is some kind of tension between those two. which I think would be of interest to journalists. So my view is, if you undertake an investigation now on a subject like this, don't look too much at the end game. Just put it out and let the people judge, let the politicians process the whole thing, let the political system process it. And the outcome, of course, will not be very clear at that stage, but it is something eminently worth doing. And that is, I think, in some ways what you have undertaken in the book. Although it's at a late stage, Paranjoy and Ravi, I think you're also basically saying that we record everything here. We let those who disagree with us have their voice in the book. We even engage with this man who strenuously and in a rather sophisticated way disputes all that you say, including the facts. It reinterprets the facts. But I think that's the only way to go. And that is, in part, the value of this book, that it is journalistic investigation at its most scrupulous, as its most, with great care, and at its best. And also your style of narration, the way of narration, I think, makes it particularly readable and useful.
Thank you. Thank you once again, Mr. Ram. Thank you, Aakar Patel. Thank you, Professor Srinath. And thank you, Ajai. Thank you, Kavita.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sanjay, Hegde, and Prashant, Bhushan is not here. Ladies and gentlemen, the last word belongs to the lead author of the book. Please give him a big hand. Ravi Nair.
Almost everything has been said. The distinguished panelists spoke at length. They explained everything, what is there in the book. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming. Read the book, spread the word, and we can engage again. Whatever the doubts you have, you can write to either I or Paranjoy. We'll be happy. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a good evening. You've been a wonderful audience. There are more than 150 of you still here. Continue to support us. We want to bring out this book in several languages. So, thank you so much once again.